Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Southern New Hampshire University Introduction to the Religions of the World podcast series, or video podcast series. This is the podcast that introduces Module 5 on Christianity, and it wraps up Module 4. So let's just take a brief moment and talk about where we are right now in the course, sort of a business update. Right now, if I can look at my screen here, we've completed 4 modules, and your milestones of the annotated bibliography and your outline for your final papers has been submitted. If you haven't submitted that, again, I urge you to please get that in as soon as possible. It will really help in the long run the sooner you do that. This week, this is Module 5 now, so at the end of this week, your rough draft for your paper is due. Please try and get that in on time so that we have ample time to look it over and I have time to make suggested changes or comments. There's not a lot of time left. We're halfway through, and so we just want to make sure that we stay on top of everything like quizzes and other things. And again, if you have any if you anticipate not being able to complete something, or if you need more time, please let me know. Okay, so coming up, we're doing the module on Christianity. Now this is just really, it's tough because to spend 1 week on each of these concepts, on looking at these religions, and it's a really difficult thing to do, to try and wrap your head around a whole religion in 1 week, especially if you're unfamiliar with it. And never is it more difficult and easy at the same time than with Christianity. Most of us, being from the West here, are familiar with Christian principles and the ideas that go along with Christian doctrine. But that familiarity is sometimes also crippling to us in our understanding, because much of what we see and what we're exposed to is not always exactly the most accurate representation of what Christianity really says, or what its practitioners are supposed to be believing. So it's a very difficult thing to do, to study something that you're both you're at once familiar with and also very unfamiliar with. So I urge you to take an honest, objective look at what you read about, and try and assess its merits and how it works, and the nature of the belief system based on the data that you receive, and maybe try and push out some of the things that you already know about Christianity and sort of take an objective look based on the data that you're presented in the module. I think that will help your understanding, and you can also see if it meshes with what you already know of the religion, and you might be able to find points of divergence and figure out what's causing those points of divergence if you find out that those two visions don't mesh. Either way, I'm excited to look at this religion now, and the attempt to sort of summarize a whole 2,000 years or so of intellectual tradition around a Judeo-Christian religion like Christianity is a very difficult thing to do. Christianity is, of course, roughly 2,000 years old, and since the high scholastic period, the 1200s through the Renaissance, there was a lot of really, really, really interesting work being done on trying to justify Christian belief through philosophical and theological investigations. So that's something that you'll be exposed to a little bit of. But if you ever have a chance to read any of St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Anselm or St. Bonaventure or any of the great medieval theologians, it's quite an interesting thing to look at their proofs for the existence of God and all the other interesting things that they've come up with. Without further ado, we will proceed to this module on Christianity. But before we get right into it, during this video, I wanted to share with you a story that I thought was kind of interesting, because in our discussion board this week, the question that you're asked is to compare and contrast the Christian view on sin and salvation with the Buddhist view of sin and salvation. Now, that seems almost like a trick question, because the concept of sin in Buddhism is almost a misnomer. It's not, but um, you know, the Buddhist view, as you know already, is view of the world, sort of their metaphysical view of the world and their cosmology, is quite different than the Christian view. So there is it's very, very easy to contrast these two. But I think the real challenge in your discussion board post is going to be in comparing the two to find points of similarity. And in order to help you do that, I want to relate a story. It's actually, it's not really a story. It's more of a Buddhist. It's like a teaching story. The actual word for it is a koan, spelled Koan. And in Buddhism, a koan is either a story or a short phrase or something that a Buddhist monk, a teacher, will give to a student in order to open their mind to a principle or a bit of knowledge that they otherwise would not have had access to. You know, one famous example is where the teacher tells the student to go off and um, you know, asks him to think about what the sound of one hand clapping is. And of course, he comes back with all these answers that aren't correct. You know, one of them is the sound of the crickets, or it's the sound of water dropping. And the teacher keeps on saying, no, 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 you don't have it right. So finally, the student sort of thinks about it forever and ever and ever. Maybe after a year, the student comes back and says, I thought and thought until I could think no more, and I reached the soundless sound. And I realized that this was the sound of one hand clapping, or something like that. And the teacher sort of says, okay, now you get it. So there's a little bit of mysticism there, and a little bit of kind of, you know, um, there's a kind of a think outside the box kind of scenario going on there. But these stories are used in Buddhism to demonstrate how you need to think about a problem, and you can continue to sort of work at it and work at it. But uh, once you step outside the box, once you realize that the standard way of thinking about it isn't quite the way to solve the problem, that it's at that point that you reach the enlightenment, and you sort of take another step in your intellectual and spiritual development. So this story that I'm about to tell you is a koan, and I think it's particularly apt to the question of comparing and contrasting Buddhist and Christian understandings of sin and salvation, um, especially on the comparison part, um, because it speaks to, I guess it speaks to the whole Buddhist notion of what it means to sin and how to define sin in Buddhism to some degree as attachment to material objects, and how to free oneself from that attachment emotionally leads to salvation. So the story, and some of you may have heard it before, it's called The Muddy Road, um, and it's about two monks who were traveling on it. So I'll tell it to you now. So imagine, there's this muddy road, and these two monks are on a journey, and they're going from one Buddhist temple to another Buddhist temple. Maybe it's an 11 or 12-hour journey on foot, and they're going along, and it starts to rain. Okay, and of course they come to this muddy road because the rain, it's like a big washout, and you can't really get by easily. It's almost it's almost unpassable. And the two monks, one of them is older and one of them is younger. And presumably at the beginning, the story, you think the older monk is the wiser, more learned monk, and the younger one is sort of new to the whole deal. And they see a girl. She's kneeling down by the muddy road, and she's fallen in the mud, and she's unable to pass the muddy road. So the young monk immediately goes over to her, picks her up, and carries her across the muddy road, puts her down on the other end, and continues on the journey. And of course, the older monk is with him, and they're going on, and they've traveled for 5 or 6 hours now beyond the muddy road in silence. And finally, the older monk, he's just been brooding and brooding about this. He's so upset, he can't let it go anymore. And he finally stops the other monk and says, "Why did you do this? You broke a major rule back there. You talked to a girl, and you talked to a beautiful girl." He goes, "We're not supposed to talk to girls, especially young and beautiful ones. It's totally taboo. It's against the teaching. We're supposed to remain separate from the worldly desires." And he was all, he's all huffy about it. He's all bent out of shape. And the young monk, with a wisdom that was clearly beyond his years, said to the older monk, "I left the girl by the muddy road. Are you still carrying her, though?" And that's how the story ends, with the question to the older monk, "Are you still carrying her?" And I think that this story is extremely instructive about how Buddhists tend to think of sin and salvation, how they think of attachment and detachment. So draw what conclusions you will from that story and use them in your comparison. Um, it's interesting because, my own interpretation of that is I really like it. I think it actually falls in line um, with Aristotle's edict of moderation in everything. Because the older monk, believed that total avoidance was the way to detach oneself from the material world and material pleasures, while the younger monk satisfied an ethical obligation and realized that detachment is not so much about avoidance, but it's more about our perspective on the material world. It's more about um, how we are emotionally in relation to material objects. Um, so I think that it's a really interesting story and a good story, and it might be helpful as you do your comparison this week. So good luck with that, and as usual, I will see you on the discussion board. Have a good week.